Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Hello. Welcome to the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we talk everything wildlife. Today's guest is Burrard-Lucas, an incredible wildlife photographer from the UK. He just released his brand new book, Land of Giants. It's unbelievable. I could not recommend it more highly. I'll read the book synopsis to provide some perspective. Deep in the heart of a vast wilderness, some of the rarest creatures on Earth still roam, living relics from a bygone era. They are the last of Africa's great tuskers. For the first time, these elusive elephants have been subject to an in-depth photographic study and are now immortalised in this book. Burrard-Lucas, in partnership with Tsavo Trust and Kenya Wildlife Service, spent months photographing elephants in all corners of the Tsavo Conservation Area. Using the latest technology, including his innovative remote-control BeetleCam, Burrard-Lucas has captured an intimate glimpse into the lives of Tsavo's elephants and a spectacular photographic record of some remarkable individuals. Against a backdrop of escalating human-wildlife conflict and the ever-present threat of poaching, this book brings a message of hope that these giants are still out there and they can still be saved. We talk in depth about his experience making this book, as well as stories of Ethiopian wolves, painted dogs, orangutans, wild pandas, and so much more. It was a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So without further ado, here it is, my chat with the one and only Burrard-Lucas. Well, Will, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast. I'm super excited that you're taking the time to chat.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on.
I've been following your work for a long time now and kind of looking through in preparation for this chat. It was really difficult for me because you've been so many places and there's so many stories behind the photographs that I wanted to learn more about. But for the sake of having some direction and some vision, I know I had to narrow that down. So, and also for the sake of relevance in terms of your work right now, I really wanted to start focusing on elephants. So can you talk a little bit about the project you're working on now and releasing soon and what the genesis of it was?
Yeah, so this project, I've been working on it for over a year. And so it's been consuming a lot of my time, but I decided for this one that I would keep it under wraps and release it all when it was done at the end. So this is really one of the first times I'm even talking about it. And basically, I've been in Tsavo in Kenya, and I've been there just focusing on elephants. And I've been working there in partnership with a conservation organization called the Tsavo Trust. And our aim is to together really put together a book that sort of celebrates these elephants that they have in Tsavo. And the book is then got the aim of helping them out, helping them achieve their goals, but also obviously an output for my work from the year. So I've been spent several months in Tsavo and had some incredible experiences, and now at the final stages of getting this book ready, which I'll be releasing soon, hopefully about the time that this podcast comes out.
Fantastic. And I'm assuming you have the choice to do a lot of different focuses on species or geographies. Why Tsavo specifically?
So this all came about, I guess, quite serendipitously. I've got a friend who I worked with previously on another really fun project, an Ethiopian wolf project, and he was the main guy there running that conservation program. And he then moved to Kenya, and we stayed in touch. And through his work in Kenya, he got to know Richard Moller, who's the CEO of the Tsavo Trust. And Richard happened to mention to him that he wanted to document these amazing elephants while they were there, and he felt like it was almost a race against time to photograph some of them before they disappeared or died of old age. So my friend Chris mentioned to him that he'd worked with me, and so through that we got connected, and it was probably a year or so chatting before we got to the stage. I think the catalyst was this quite famous elephant got poached in Tsavo, and we realized it's got to be done now, because the longer we leave it, who knows, maybe these elephants won't be around much longer. I'm specifically referring to these elephants with really big tusks, these big tuskers, and there's about 20 of them in Africa, 20 that would have tusks that each weigh over 100 pounds, and 8 of them at the moment can be found in Tsavo. So it's pretty much the last sustainable gene pool where there's a few of them, and where hopefully these genes can be saved. So yeah, it sort of feels like, if things don't go well, this could be the last opportunity anyone has to document these elephants. And so we decided, we've just got to make it happen. And so I really pretty much dropped everything in terms of the projects or any other projects. And I even bought a car in Kenya so that I could be more flexible and spend more time out in the field and just focus on this project. So I've spent a good few months just in Tsavo, just photographing elephants, really.
Wait, so each of the tusks weighs 100 pounds?
Yeah, so it's like this concept of 100-pounder came from the hunting days, where that was what people really wanted when they went to Africa, was to shoot a 100-pounder, and so they were always rare, but there used to be a lot more of them. Now, yeah, they're so hard to come across, and as I say, probably only 20 or so left, and in the last 3-4 years, probably that number's down by a third. So they really are, pretty rare these days.
Well, and to put that into perspective, a fact that I read, I think in some of your work, was that there's 13,000 elephants in Tsavo, right? And of those, only 8 or 9 of those are big tuskers. So when you get a sense of the percentage, it's a very small pool.
Exactly. Even in this sort of stronghold of elephants, it's only a tiny fraction that ever get, number one, old enough, number two, have the right, I guess, nutrition and diet, and then they obviously have to have the genes as well. And because they're so highly prized by poachers, previously by hunters, these genes through the years, through the decades, are becoming rarer and rarer, because these are the first elephants that get targeted, even 200 years ago by ivory hunters or whatever. So it's very much a dwindling gene pool. In some places where I was focusing a lot of time previously in South Luangwa in Zambia, actually through this, I guess, unnatural pressure on elephants with tusks, there are now a lot more elephants that are actually just growing up without tusks, because that gene obviously gives them such a survival advantage. So I think it's a trend, in a lot of places that, these elephants with big tusks, or even tusks at all, are becoming harder to find.
And do you have a sense, back before poaching and hunting was a big issue, was it much more, obviously it was more common to see it, but was it still rare to get to that 100-pound size, or is it something where...
I wouldn't be able to tell you, this number of elephants would grow to become 100-pounders, but it was certainly a lot more common 200 years ago. And I would imagine, an old bull elephant, with the right diet and stuff, would probably, in areas where they got those genes, would probably have a pretty good chance of becoming a 100-pounder if they're left to their own devices. But it's just that, for 200 years they've been targeted. So it's amazing, really, there's any left, I'd say.
I would imagine that at this point in time, those 9 are being monitored rather carefully, kind of almost like a rhino in South Africa or something.
They are and they aren't. So the area that they're in is 40,000 square kilometers. So that's an area equivalent to the size of Switzerland. It's like a whole country, and there's 8 or 9 elephants, and they are literally dispersed over this whole area. And a lot of this area you can't get around by road. There's no roads in it. The tourism area is a very small fraction of the Tsavo Conservation Area. So it's impossible to patrol by vehicle. So what the Tsavo Trust does is they do have this big tusker project where they do prioritize these elephants, because by protecting them, you're by default protecting all the other elephants in the area that these elephants found. So they do focus on these big tuskers, and they'll be flying patrols every day, trying to put eyes on each elephant as often as possible, and patrolling the area, looking for signs of poachers and things. But one plane, 8 elephants, an area the size of Switzerland. There's only so much that can be done with limited resources. So they're doing fantastic work, but it just takes a lapse of a few hours, and a poacher can slip in and take one down. So it's a really tough tough battle they're fighting.
Can you set the scene as to what that Tsavo area looks like? Like, what is the geography like? Is it like a deep bush, or is it pretty open? Like, if a poacher were to come in, is it easy to kind of lose them when you're doing the aerial surveillance?
So it's pretty thick bush. It's not a very easy place as a photographer to work because there is often quite thick bush to try and sort of get clear shots through. And so on the land, you wouldn't see a poacher if he was hiding in a bush a little way away. So from the air, you're looking for telltale signs like at dawn, you'll be looking for a little plume of smoke that might indicate a cooking fire or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the scouts on the ground will be looking for things like footprints and stuff, tracks in the earth where poachers might have gone. And a lot will also come from local intelligence. So there's informers in the villages around the area who are paid to keep their eyes and ears open, and if they get wind that maybe poaching parties going in, maybe tip off the right people. So there's a sort of multi-pronged approach because if you just try and one method, it's very easy, I guess, to avoid. They also have rhinos in that area, and there the approach is a bit different in that they're able to contain the rhinos in one area and then intensively patrol that area. So there they do have permanent, one or two scouts that will camp out on top of a hill with binoculars and just 24 hours a day are scanning the ground looking for signs of poachers and things. But because the rhinos don't move around that much, they have their territories. That's feasible. These elephants, they can go, in the course of a few months, they could roam an area that's 1,000 kilometers across.
Oh, so really?
It's and you can't really contain them if they would barge down any fence that you try to put in their way. So it's not really an approach you can take with these elephants, particularly these old canny bull elephants who just go where they want.
And if the aerial surveillance is going on and they find a group of poachers, what is the typical approach to stopping them? Is it always through force, or do they ever arrest? What is
they'll always try and arrest. So what they'll do, if they spot them from the air, they will mark the GPS position of them and really try not to tip off the poachers that they've been seen. So if they look down and see a fire, they won't circle it. They'll mark the location, fly off as if they haven't seen it, and then the Kenya Wildlife Service scouts will come in a chopper or come in on the ground and try and ambush them basically and catch them and take them to trial. So I think it would only sort of get into a gunfight if the rangers were fired on by the poachers, but otherwise they'd try and arrest them. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
I think a lot of the time though that they do get caught. That's one scenario, is they go in while they're in the park, catch them before they've killed an animal or while they're waiting to ambush an animal. But then often I think they're arrested when they're trying to offload the ivory, or when they come back to the village and hide the ivory, bury it under their bed or something. And that's when a tip-off or something means that the scouts can go in and arrest them with the ivory. But obviously it's then too late for the elephant.
Do you feel optimistic at all that things are shifting in the right direction in terms of the protection of these animals?
I think it's very optimistic that they're there to start with. So I think through the book, that's really the message we're trying to get across, is it's not too late. Whereas a lot of people, when people see these pictures of these animals, they're amazed that they're even still out there. So it's very optimistic from that point of view, and there's plenty still to save. There's these 8 big tuskers, but there's about 20 emerging tuskers who within the next 10 years could become big tuskers. So, with some concerted effort, for the next decade, then this number could go up. So I feel a lot of hope that in this area, it's got a lot going for it because it is this massive area, 40,000 square kilometers of basically elephant habitat, which is a fantastic resource. So the habitat's there, and if just poaching can be kept at bay, then there's enough space for these elephants, and I think that's what's key.
Do you have any particular approaches or methodologies? I know it's a multi-pronged approach, but that you think will be kind of the next step, or where listeners, if they wanted to donate or could focus their time and attention, where they should be, like which efforts are making the biggest impact?
So the guys I've been working with, the Tsavo Trust, are they're small, but they make every dollar count and really doing very valuable work in securing Tsavo, and also working with local communities to give them what they need so that they don't need to, plunder the resources of the park. So they, helping them out, building them wells, or helping them deal with, if the elephants are coming and raiding their crops, maybe helping them come up with solutions to mitigate some of those issues. So Tsavo Trust, and they often work hand in hand with Save the Elephants, another NGO. And checking out either of their websites, you can find out a lot more about the issue.
Yeah, that's awesome. So going into your work when you were there, if it's this massive area the size of Switzerland, and a lot of it's pretty deep bush, how did you go about finding these tuskers and photographing them? And on what was the average frequency that you could even find them?
Yeah, so if I'd been working on my own, I would have had zero chance of finding a single one of them. So really, it was only by teaming up with the Tsavo Trust that this project was possible at all. And because they're flying every day patrolling, and they're seeing these, trying to find these elephants, year round, they have a pretty good idea of roughly where to find them. So the one that I spent the most time looking for was the biggest of all. His sort of code name is LU1. And to find him, they would fly the area that he was last seen, slowly sort of working out from the last point he was seen, peering down. And for a couple of hours, you might be just, doing cross sections of the earth, trying to find him. And then eventually, if he is spotted from the air, and when you do spot him, he's unmistakable with these huge gleaming, tusks that sort of glint in the sunlight. Then check his GPS position and try and get in on the land, in a vehicle or something to get some clear shots on the ground. And often he would be in such thick bush that would be impossible. We might be trying to drive towards him through the bush, and the car's just scraping with bushes each side. He's going to hear us a mile away. Right. So it was often really hard to get close to him that way. But yeah, we might try, fail one day, fly again the next day, then not find him for a few days because he was, I don't know, maybe under a tree or something, and at the time we flew over or whatever. But probably found him on average once every 3 days from the air. And then we had a few times going in on land, not really able to get close enough for the shots I wanted, before eventually we actually ditched the car, went in on foot in an area that wasn't so thick that we would be on top of him by the time we got a clear view of him. And that then gave me enough of a clear shot through to him to get the first shots of him. And then over the course of the year, I had more opportunities to photograph him. But certainly getting shots of him for the first time, it was really at that stage I was thinking, how am I going to get a whole book of photos when it's taking me weeks just to get one shot of this guy? But yeah, it did get easier through the course of the year. Their behavior changes a bit. They move into different areas based on where the best food is or where maybe the females are. So later in the year, he moved into a more open area where I was able to get a lot more shots of him.
I wonder if he recognizes that he's famous. Like, there must be some part of him that's like, well, these things are flying every day over, and when I do hear them more, oftentimes they're followed by these cars and people staring at me for a little bit.
The thing is, he's not that famous in that he's so hard to see that tourists don't know about him or don't know to go and try and find him. And so the Tsavo Trust see him every day from the air, but they probably go in on the land, once a month maybe, because he is just a pain to try and see on the land. So that, they can sort of keep him safe from seeing him from the air, making sure they're patrolling that area. They don't necessarily need to see him on the ground. It's only when I join them and I then need to get close enough for a photo that we end up really trying to get close to him. So yeah, he lives I think I wouldn't be surprised if he goes several months at a time, certain times of year without really coming across a human on the land. Yeah. They live in pretty remote areas, some of these elephants.
When you got off and were on foot, was there any fear of, are there predators in the area like lions, and also like charging of the elephant? Was there any of that kind of adrenaline flow?
So these elephants, first of all, I was going in on land on foot with Richard Moller, the CEO of Tsavo Trust, who really knows what he's doing. So I pretty much don't have any fear because I'm pretty sure, if he knows what he's doing and he's happy to do this, and then I'm gonna be happy to do it. So yeah, I don't really, I don't think he's gonna do anything that's dangerous. So I pretty much put my faith in them that what we're doing is going to be okay. So yeah, we'll sometimes walking quite a long way on foot. And yeah, there's a lot of other wildlife, but most of these animals, lions, hyenas, whatever, they run. It's only if you're really stupid that you'd ever get into any sort of danger with these animals. Mostly they don't want anything to do with people. So it's not really, you just have to obviously be careful where you step. Don't step on a snake or something. But
right.
It's not. I don't feel ever, threatened. So, but then it comes to the elephant himself and these big tuskers. I think they've only really got to that age by being really canny and smart, and not being, they're pretty streetwise animals. And so, particularly when they're in a dangerous area, they'll know that. If they're in an area perhaps where there's not a lot of tourism activity, not a lot of people, or maybe near where there's villages, they know when an area is a bit dodgy. And the first time we went in on foot, the elephant was in one of these areas, and it's amazing how their behavior varies. If you come across them in a safe part of the park, they can be really chilled out and you can get quite close and they don't care. But in this area, an area where he's edgy anyway, and we were coming in on foot, he was pretty touchy. So we had to come in so he couldn't detect us. We'd come downwind so he couldn't smell us. We had to be completely silent. So, really watching every step, not to snap a branch or something. And then we always had to be aware of, if he comes at us now, where are we going to go to get out of his way? So, you've always got a sort of escape route planned and always aware of what he's doing. The other thing is he's not on his own. He's got a couple of younger bulls with him, and they can be less predictable than him often. So while you're focused in on him, you've also got to be aware of what these other elephants are doing and make sure you're not getting, your escape route isn't getting blocked off by one of them. So sometimes it's just not possible to go in on foot because there are these other elephants that just make it impossible to get a nice route through to him. But this first occasion I did manage to get him. We were able to basically see which way he was heading, get in front of him and just wait with a nice open air in front, so that when he came into that area, there's a clear shot through, but he wasn't so close that he would, on top of us already. So, we did that. He was just kept coming. I was basically crouching on this, just in the sort of, just below this bush. So the bush was breaking up my outline. And he was just coming straight towards me. I was sort of shooting until the last possible moment when Richard said, okay, now we got to back off. And the moment we moved, he then sees the movement. They don't have the best eyesight, elephants. It's mostly sight and sound and smell. So it was only when I moved that he saw me. But then he's like, whoa, what's that? He paused for a split second before doing this mock charge. By that point, I was already backing off. And so he sort of pulls up just short of where I'd been crouching, flaps his ears and then just melts off into the bush.
Wow.
So yeah, it's pretty cool experience. But I put my trust in Richard that he wasn't going to trample me to death.
Do you know if they're held in any higher regard within the elephant community? Like, is he like a Brad Pitt of attraction, or like revered like a David Attenborough or something like that within his
I think so.
crew?
Like I did see, I went back at a different time of year when he was in must, and that's when they're really aggressive, and it's when they're really pursuing the females. And there weren't a lot of other bull elephants really. I don't see many interacting with him. I think they do give him a wide berth. Right now he is in his prime. I guess as he gets older, he sort of maybe gets pushed out by younger males. But right now he's the other males certainly respect him. That's for sure.
Is there a moment sorry, go ahead.
No, again.
I was going to say, is there a moment that sticks out to you throughout the 18 months that you were shooting this book as like the most memorable or the most beautiful experience that you had in the Tsavo?
Yeah. So the project lasted 18 months. I wasn't actually in the field 18 months. I'd sort of go in and out. So it's probably a total of maybe 4 months with the elephants over the course of the year and a half. But okay, so there's this other elephant who's actually a female, but she has these amazing tusks that reach right down to the ground. And because the female's bodies are smaller, I'd say her tusks, her huge long tusks on this smaller body are almost more impressive in a photograph. So
wow.
And I'd seen photographs of big tusker males before, and I sort of knew what to expect there, but I'd never seen photos of a cow elephant like this one. And Richard told me about her, and we obviously wanted to photograph her. But the first time I saw her, I was just absolutely blown away. And a good number of the photos of the book in the book, and certainly my favorite photos, and even the cover of the book is this one particular cow tusker called Mudanda, who there's no way to describe it. You just got to see the photos of her to believe it. It's almost like looking at a mammoth. These tusks are so incredible.
Yeah, I know the photo you're talking about, and to listeners, I was lucky enough to see or at least the draft of the book before it came out, and it's stunning. Like,
thank you.
I can't wait to see it in its final form because I want that on my coffee table. But
thank you.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, my job was easy. The privilege of being out there, being able to photograph these elephants, taking the photos is easy, but it's just the access to these elephants and the fact that they're still there is what makes a book, I guess.
I've noticed you've spent a lot of time in different areas of Africa. Do you notice vast differences from elephant population to elephant population depending upon the governance of each country?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Yeah. So I did a project in Namibia, in the northern bit between Angola and Botswana. There's this strip called the Zambezi Strip.
Okay.
And there they'd had quite bad poaching over the years and not a massive amount of tourism. And the elephants there, they are super aggressive. I remember this one time I was just driving and went past this thicket, and this elephant charges out of the thicket and chases my car down the road as I'm trying to drive away.
Really?
Yeah, just super aggressive. And I mean, that's one extreme. Then you go to an area where they're well protected and safe. It can actually be a very geographically short distance away. So in the Okavango Delta, just south of where I was. And there, you can drive past an elephant within touching distance, and they just, don't care at all. So, very much based on their experiences of humans is how they'll often respond towards us.
Do you think Kenya, specifically in the Tsavo region, is it one of the healthier elephant populations in Eastern Africa?
Yeah, definitely. It's such a big wilderness area with such a good elephant population. They used to have, I think, I'm plucking the figure from my memory a bit, it might be wrong, but I think they used to have about 4 times more elephants in the 60s. And then there was this really bad poaching epidemic in the 70s and 80s where the population was completely decimated. It was much lower than it is now even. Then in the 90s and since then, the elephant population has recovered, but it's still not at the levels it used to be. The problem now in a lot of places, not so much Tsavo because it is so big, but in other places where there is this healthy population of elephants maybe, but it's what's around the national parks that's a problem. So what's not being protected, the areas around the national parks, people have moved in, they're growing crops and things. And it basically maroons the elephants in these protected areas. Mm-hmm. But historically, elephants would have been very nomadic. They would have, in the dry season, they would have, wandered far and wide in search of food. But now they really are just stuck in these national parks, whatever it is. And, at some times of year, if the national park, it's very dry and there's not a lot of food, their only option really is to raid crops. And that's when you get, a lot of problems with human-wildlife conflict. So, yeah, it's a tough challenge.
I want to back up a little bit and learn a little bit more about what got you into this work in the first place. I saw that you're from the UK, but you spent a lot of time in Tanzania when you were a kid, which I don't think is like the normal backstory of a person.
So, we lived there for 3.5 years when I was really little. So, like primary school age, and pretty much my first memories really. Early memories are from that time living in Tanzania, and ever since then safari wildlife have been a massive passion of mine. So as long as I can remember really, my fond memories of going back, going on safari with my parents back in the day in the 80s. So that's definitely where the love of nature came from. And growing up, I'd consume any natural history documentary, anything to do with the natural world I was interested in. But I never realized or even thought that I'd be able to make a living out of doing anything with wildlife or nature. And then it was when digital cameras came along that I got into photography. Before that, I'd dabbled in it a bit, but it never really took off because I never had that ability to see the results as I was taking them. So by the time I took a photo, got the roll developed a week later, I'd forgotten what I'd done to take that photo, and I just it didn't happen for me. But then the moment digital came along and I was able to get that instant feedback and then experiment with settings to get the shot right, that's when I really started to fall in love with photography. And that was while I was at university, and I always tried to travel as much as possible during my holidays and things. And naturally, I was traveling to places to see wildlife. And so very soon I found I was focusing on wild subjects in my photography as well. And so within a year or two of picking up photography, I was really focusing in on wildlife photography and built it up from there. That's how it all started.
Was there a moment, kind of an inflection point, where you were like, wow, I can really take this from a hobby to a profession?
Yeah, I guess there were a few along the way. So I've always done a lot, dabbled in the internet, building websites and that sort of thing. So very early on, I had a website to show my photos on and sort of start getting my stuff out there, building a bit of a following. And so I remember making my first sale in 2004, and that, I guess, started me on this track of putting my images online, a bit like a stock library on my website, and people finding them through Google search and things like that, gradually building up some revenue that way. And over the years that followed, so the next 6 years, I was, I guess, quite intentionally building up my online presence, building up my following, building up my revenue stream, until it got to a point in 2010 where I was able to just I'd sort of built it up to a point where I knew it wasn't a complete punt in the dark to try and make a go at it. And so I just, in 2010, that was the point where I decided, I'm going to try and make it happen, and left what I was doing before and just started doing the photography full time. And fortunately, I haven't looked back. But I think the point that I knew I could do that was was in 2009 was the first time I used BeetleCam, my remote control camera buggy. And that really blew up and got a lot of attention, and I guess really kickstarted a lot of things in terms of my reputation, the sort of licensing images and that sort of thing. And so that was probably the biggest turning point, in that once that happened, I think it really did just get me to that level where I could start to make a living from it.
And you've built a business around BeetleCam, right? Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what's unique about it?
Yeah, so it's this remote control buggy. Basically, as I was finding myself as a wildlife photographer, trying to figure out where I fitted into things, I was obviously trying to take images that people would notice. And so very quickly realizing, I've got to show people things they haven't seen before. And something I was trying to do a lot of at the time, so this is like 2007 sort of time, is get closer, use a wide angle lens to get a more intimate perspective, showing more environment. And it wasn't something that was being done a lot back then. Most of wildlife photography was very much telephoto with a shallow depth of field and shallow field of view. And so it did, when I started taking these photos, they really did sort of strike a chord with me, but also other people saw them and they were something a bit different and something with a bit more impact. And initially I was achieving that by just crawling up to whatever animal I could. So that was things like penguins or meerkats, so pretty unthreatening species where if I got too close, I wasn't going to die. But
I was shocked at how close meerkats would let you get to it. Like there's some photos of you literally like 2 feet away from a pod of
so
meerkats.
Those particular ones have been habituated over many generations actually by researchers. And so from the moment they come out of the den for the first time, they get used to people. And so, they just see us as part of the landscape, that those particular meerkats. And if you're still and you don't do anything, those sudden movements, they'll even climb on you to get a better look at, of their surroundings if you're really careful. So
it's funny because I always associated, when you see the wildlife films of meerkats, it's always that they're underground and popping their head out looking for predators. And I always just assumed that they were like the most anxiety ridden species of all time, kind of like popping their heads out of ground and hoping they can come outside.
And if you come across meerkats that aren't used to humans, they are completely, there was the meerkats I came across in northern Namibia, and before I could even see them in binoculars, or at the point I could just about tell what they were in binoculars, they were already running away from me.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And so, those ones are pretty paranoid. But then these ones in Botswana that I got very close to, yeah, they've learnt humans aren't threatened. But yeah, they see a bird of prey or a jackal or something, then it's a different story. So
right.
I guess it's just, yeah, they're pretty smart animals. They know what they're doing.
So you were taking these wide angle shots of the meerkats and the penguins,
Yeah.
and that kind of led to, it's
Yeah, so
essentially
this
like
perspective-
a remote control vehicle, right? That you put a camera in
Yeah.
and it drives up
Yeah.
to the
So
bigger-
yeah, my passion being in Africa, I wanted to figure out how I could get these shots in Africa, and the logical solution for me, without risking my life, was to try and build a remote control camera buggy, basically, which would get my camera close. And I didn't really know if it would work out, whether the animals would destroy it or run away from it or whatever. But I figured to try and get this different perspective, it was worth trying. So that was back in 2009. I did that for the first time, and we didn't get a huge amount. Got some elephants, and I got one sequence of photos of a lion before the camera got chewed, and that was the only sequence I got that trip. But the few photos I did get from that trip did do really well. Like, people, they were published widely. People were really connected with them and had a lot of impact. So I knew I was onto something. But it was actually a couple of years before I actually returned to the concept, built a new version of the BeetleCam, which was actually a bit more robust and lion-proof, and went out again specifically to focus on lions. So this is now 2011, and did a whole sequence of lion photos, which again did really well. And since then, I've kept coming back to BeetleCam for various projects just to get that different perspective. The elephant project, my most recent one, I did a lot with BeetleCam, getting the perspective where their tusks are coming down towards the camera, really close, wide angle. That perspective really accentuates their size. You really feel like they're towering over you when you photograph them from the ground like that. So yeah, it was a big part of that project. My project before that, a focus of mine has been really using the latest digital cameras. So this was a project probably started in 2012, 13. Suddenly we had these cameras with really incredible high ISO performance, and we could start photographing animals at night in ways that we couldn't do before. And so I got really excited about this and started thinking, how can I use these cameras to take photos of wildlife at night that haven't been done before? And so what I wanted to do was photograph them with stars behind in the sky.
Right.
And in order to do that, I had to get low, that same perspective, so I could get the sky behind them. So again, BeetleCam came into its own there, with being able to get my camera down low, look up at animals, and expose the stars behind them. So yeah, it's a sort of pretty handy tool to have when I need that low down perspective.
Well, I think it's a perspective that hadn't been really seen as much in the wildlife photography space, because the only other way that angle was captured, and before I knew about the BeetleCam, I always just assumed it was like a remote camera trap. But the difficulty with the remote camera traps is you just don't have the control over it. And also if for some reason it comes out blurry, or like the animal's just not in frame, I mean, you get one shot at it. Whereas with this, it essentially gives you the ability to have consistent attempts at taking camera trap style photos.
Exactly. So for the right species, it's much more effective, I guess, than camera traps. But then the problem with it can only really be used with quite bold animals who aren't going to be frightened by an unfamiliar object moving through the grass. But anything that's prey is programmed to avoid, anything like that. So I could use it for the predators, the big carnivores, elephants, buffalo, a few animals, but certainly not everything. And so that's actually then led me, I wanted to get this perspective with more creatures. So actually I then started using camera traps a lot more as well. And so I use camera traps to get this close-up perspective of the more elusive, shyer, skittish creatures as well.
Do you find that with the BeetleCam that the interactions usually come from the animal being interested in the BeetleCam, or is it more that you just drive it around until you get a good angle of them?
Yeah, so the way I've used it has definitely evolved over the years. To start with, I was just seeing what I could get, and I was using it with things like lions that were very inquisitive and playful and would come and investigate it. So I got a lot of eye contact and that sort of thing. On the elephant project, more recently, I was trying to keep it, I just keep it still next to a waterhole, let the animals, basically get used to it and start to ignore it. And then I was getting my shots that way. So I wanted a much more sort of candid type of feel to the shot, so not the same sort of eye contact and that sort of thing. So the way I use it sort of can then determine the sort of if there is interaction, or if I give the animals long enough to get used to it, then and leave it still so it's not moving, they forget about it, and then they go on doing whatever they're doing at the waterhole, and I'm just they're snapping photos. I'm trying to. I've been using it a bit differently in this last project.
Yeah, and I'll link a lot of those specific photos in the show notes. So if people want to check out what the wide angle lens looks like and kind of get a little more perspective on this conversation, definitely check it out because the photos are unbelievable.
Yeah, thanks.
I want to talk a little bit. Obviously, you've traveled the world documenting different species of animals, but it seems like the bulk of your work has been in Africa. Is that correct? But two, is there a reason that you're drawn to Africa more than other geographies?
Yeah, so I think when I was getting started, I was drawn to traveling as much as possible, seeing as much as possible, going as many different places as possible. So that's really when a lot of my images from elsewhere in the world came about. Then in 2012, we had the opportunity to move to Zambia for a year, my wife and I. And that was a whole year where I just focused on my photography and just spent most of the time in South Luangwa National Park. I really took a body of work that was much deeper than anything I'd done before. And from that year, a few things happened, but I guess the main things were that I started making a lot of contacts in Africa, which then opened doors to new projects.
Right.
And the sort of projects where I could get access that wouldn't be possible if I was just flitting around from country to country. So
for sure,
building these relationships, getting to know researchers, conservationists, tourism operators, getting to know them well enough that I could then get access and undertake photo projects that would allow me to capture something that hadn't been seen before. Those sort of opportunities really did start opening up, and so I found myself traveling back to Africa more and more as and it just becomes this snowball effect where the more you do there, the more opportunities there are. So each time I go, I end up thinking of another 3 projects that I want to do next in the similar area. And so it really is a case of, as the more you sort of focus on an area, I think you find more to photograph there. It's not a case of running out. And so that's one reason. I mean, I think my style of photography, and also just I love being in these wide open wilderness areas where I don't see another car all day. And Africa, there are those places where I can still go to get that. And so that's for me what I love about being out in Africa.
Well, what kind of something that I really appreciate about your work is the fact that you can tell you've spent such a long period of time there, because a good chunk of your work has been done with species that I think are often overlooked by people who travel there and just go because if you're in Africa, you got to get the lions and the elephants. But if you're spending a lot of time there, like I've seen you do deep conservation work with things like painted dogs and Ethiopian wolves. And that's something I'd like to dig in a little bit more about, because oftentimes, even on the podcast, like it's just a species of animals that are beautiful, unique animals, but nobody really talks about too frequently. So can you talk a little bit about your conservation work with the painted, maybe we'll start with painted dogs and then move into the Ethiopian wolves? Yeah,
maybe better to start the other way around. The wolves were probably my first big like conservation focused project. So this was back in 2011. And actually, I teamed up with a photographer from San Francisco. Her name's Rebecca Jackrell. She sadly passed away now, but she had this passion for doing conservation-focused photography, but she hadn't done much in Africa. And I'd obviously done quite a lot in Africa, and we met in London, and she basically said, I want to do this project on Ethiopian wolves because, they're pretty much under photographed. Not many people have photographed them. They're pretty much neglected, and yet there's only 500 of them left, and they're this incredibly unique animal. They're a wolf in Africa. There's no other animal like them. Their closest relative is grey wolves in Europe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they came down in the last ice age, came down into Africa, and then as it sort of dried out and got warmer, they got marooned in these high altitude areas. And so there's just these few pockets where you get these wolves in this Afro-alpine habitat. And about 500 left. They're under massive threat from things like rabies, canine distemper, just habitat loss.
500 across Africa?
Yeah,
Oh, wow. I
500
didn't know it was
individuals. Yeah, so
bad.
about between 400 and 500, and it sort of fluctuates. They have a rabies outbreak, it crashes down to 400. When we were there, I think it was about 400, and then it sort of recovers, and then a few years later, there's another outbreak. So what we did is we raised the money for that expedition on Kickstarter. Kickstarter was really new. I think it had only been around about a year or so, and people were still figuring out how to use it really, or what it was good for. But what we did was we raised about $10,000 through Kickstarter that paid basically for the cost of us spending about a month out there, and we were able to basically give a chunk of that to the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program, who were able to then lend us a vehicle and a guide and things to take us out so that we could focus on photographing these wolves. And then after that, we put the photos together into a book and donated the proceeds from that book to the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program. And so what we were able to do, it took a while to just put the book together and then to sell enough, but basically we were able to take that $10,000 from the Kickstarter campaign. And I can't remember exactly how much we've donated now, but it's more than double that is what we've then been able to give back to the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program in terms of donations from selling the book and prints and things like that. And obviously that ignores the sort of awareness that the book's been able to raise. And
that's incredible.
They've been able to use the book, to give away to donors and that sort of thing. So it really gave me a taste of what would be possible. And that was quite, I guess, maybe a small level project, but it really sort of showed me, by teaming up with these conservationists as a photographer, what I get out of it is access and using, relying on their knowledge and their understanding of these species, I'm able to then get shots which I wouldn't be able to get otherwise, and then they get the images they can use, and hopefully I can help them with whatever goals they've got, whether it's raising awareness or trying to raise funds and that sort of thing.
I would imagine they're incredibly elusive animals, especially if there's only 400 or 500 of them to actually be able to find. You kind of need that grassroots know-how. What was that experience like? Like, how did you find them? Is there the same predatory fear that you would have with like a gray wolf in Europe?
Not so much. These wolves, they basically evolved to specialize in hunting rodents. This Afro-alpine habitat has an incredible biomass just of rodents per square kilometer, and so these wolves basically hunt mole rats, which are about this big. Sorry, I don't know if people aren't watching the video. Then they're about the size of I guess like a chihuahua or something, but without the long legs. Down to these little mice and rats and things, and that's all they'll eat like 10 a day or something. So they're not like hunting big animals. So I don't you don't feel any sort of threat from them. But they're pretty skittish, and most of the year, if you come across them, you're not going to get within 100 meters. Even 600, 800 millimeter lens range would they're not close enough. So the only way to get the photos that we got of them is to go when they're denning. And that's the only time you can be sure they're going to be in this particular place. And so that's when you can then go there, wait, and get the close-up shots. So obviously the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program, they're the ones who know where the dens are and, know what's going to be, responsible in terms of how close we can get and not disturbing them and that sort of thing. So by working with them, we were able to have access to the dens, get the shots we needed, but also obviously use their knowledge to make sure what we were doing was not going to be to the detriment of the wolves and that sort of thing. So that's what we did. We went out when they were denning, spent about 5 weeks with 4 different packs, and we'd sort of try and time when we were with each pack with when their pups were coming out. So they were all at sort of slightly different stages. So we basically were able to get different age pups as they were growing up and sort of learning how to be Ethiopian wolves. And it was amazing. Yeah,
it always amazes me how much people who spend a lot of time in certain areas can develop that know-how. I mean, a good example is I spent some time in Yellowstone a couple of years ago. Yeah. And you could always see that there'd be certain people pulled over on the side of the road with these long telescopes, like things that you couldn't even use as a camera. Yeah. And I'd be like, hey, what are you looking at? And he's like, oh, I found a wolf denning over here. You want to come look at it? And I'd be like, yeah. And I'd look in his telescope and it was, a mile away. and it was like the smallest blur of like, you could barely even make out that it was a wolf. I was like, how did you even come close to finding that? And it's strictly just because they know where the dens are and they can kind of get what they can get. There's no way you would be panning across the landscape and be like, oh, there's one. You know what I mean? It's just it's too much of a needle in a haystack.
Yeah. And that's why the local knowledge and the local contact is so key, whether it's a good guide or conservationists or researchers who understand these animals better than I could ever understand them. By working with them, that's the only way to sort of get a lot of these shots. What
is the issue with rabies? Is it or canine distemper? Is it something where they come in contact with feral dogs or something?
So they're in this national park, say, and they're the villagers all around the national park, but there's also people coming into the park to collect firewood, that sort of thing, and they have dogs. I mean, they keep dogs, but really the dogs are there to fend for themselves. They have to find their own food, and they just wander off, go where they want. And these dogs, often have things like rabies or canine distemper, and they very regularly come into contact with the Ethiopian wolves, and so it's very easy for the disease to get transmitted. And then these wolves are very sociable. They're pack animals just like grey wolves. And so if one wolf in the pack gets it, they very quickly, the whole pack can have it. And so they you can lose a whole pack to it in a matter of weeks. So what the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program have been doing is they've had this vaccination program. So they vaccinate, again, I don't know the exact number, it's about 10,000 dogs a year in the surrounding communities they vaccinate. And then when we were out there, they were just starting this trial to vaccinate the wolves themselves. And it was actually an oral vaccine. So they would put down some meat with the vaccine in it. And then the wolves would eventually come and eat the meat. And while we were there, they'd just done this, and they were then capturing the wolves, taking blood samples to then test if they were getting antibodies to rabies. And actually that proved to be successful. So now
that's great.
They are giving some protection. They found it actually is very sort of effective at protecting them. I don't know if they've got a solution for distemper yet, but certainly for rabies, they're able to administer these oral vaccines to the wolves just through some meat laced with the vaccine. And that then gives them some protection. So the last outbreak was distemper, and I don't know if they've sort of come up with a solution to that. But
is that a similar issue with the painted dogs? I didn't even really know what a painted dog was until I started digging into your work a little bit. They're amazing looking animals. They're like almost like black and yellow spotted. How big are they? As big as like a normal, like a German Shepherd or something like that?
Possibly. I mean, they're much slighter, but actually their size, they probably are similar size, and certainly their jaws are probably they're pretty powerful jaws. So their head is probably the size of a German Shepherd, just less fluffy, but then their bodies are pretty skinny. They can just run all day. They're sort of built for stamina. But they're really cool. Their coloration actually varies quite a lot across Africa. So they're found all the way from Namibia and South Africa, all the way up. I've seen them in Kenya, but I think they go a bit further than that. But across that whole range, there's between 3,000 and 5,000, something like that, individuals. So not that many across this huge area. And so they're very fragmented. And the thing with them is they have these huge territories. And they don't really do that well in places where there's a lot of lions or a lot of hyenas or a lot of other predators to compete with. So they often get pushed out of protected areas where there are these big densities of lions particularly, and end up roaming these huge areas in and amongst communities. And often these are places where people will be setting snares to catch bushmeat, antelope, small antelopes, that sort of thing. So because they're covering so much ground, snaring is a big problem. They're also very susceptible to dog diseases that are transmitted from domestic dogs, so rabies, other things like roadkill and things, in areas where there's busy roads. So there's quite a few threats to them. But they're amazing animals. They just run and run and run. So they have one of the highest sort of percentage success rates when they embark on a hunt. They're more likely than any other predator in Africa to actually catch that animal they're after. And the reason is they just run after it until it's so exhausted it can't run anymore, and they can keep going. So this one time I remember following them on a hunt, and we had the sort of the kilometer counter on the vehicle, so we could see how far we'd gone. We followed them 20 kilometers until they made the kill, and that was before breakfast really. And then we followed. They sort of eat as fast as they can because they're paranoid about some other animal coming and stealing it. So they just wolf it down in the matter of 10, 15 minutes, and then they at this time of year they were denning. So then they just returned the way they came. And by lunch, they were back at the den. So they just did the equivalent of a marathon before lunch. And that was just one kill. And the next day, they'll just go off in a different direction, just keep running until they kill something and then come back. So they're incredible predators. But yeah, they do have a lot of challenges, particularly in areas where there's a lot of lions.
Have they been domesticated at all? Or
no,
Ethiopian wolves, have those?
No, I don't know if anyone's tried with wolves, but I don't think. Yeah, I think some attempts with painted dogs have been domesticated to try and domesticate them, but yeah, they can't be tamed really. There was this one wolf that was this one painted dog that it had been, I think, inbred or something, so it had short legs and it wasn't really fit to be out there breeding. So they had that one as a sort of ambassador animal. And it was one of the scariest animals I've seen because if you got too close to it, it was just vicious. It had no fear of people. So yeah, they're not really domesticatable, I don't think.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought was interesting is I was talking to Russell McLaughlin, who does a lot of work in India. And he was talking about these, he fell in love with the dholes, which are essentially like Indian dogs. And he said they're virtually impossible to domesticate, whereas you look at them and they look much more like a dog than a wolf would. But the wolves are really where all domestic dogs have come from because for some reason there's been that type of relationship that humans could establish with them that was impossible with things that just happen to be called dogs.
No,
I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Why wolves would be domesticatable and wild dogs not. But I guess it's just, something maybe in their pack structure or something that makes it possible.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of getting back to how I opened up the podcast. There was a breadth of things that I wanted to talk about, but I know we just couldn't go in depth into. But I made a list of 3 photos that I saw that I really just want to get a little bit more understanding as to kind of the story behind the photo. The first were the orangutans in Indonesia. What was that experience like? Going into the forest, finding them, being able to photograph them. I'm obsessed with primates in general, particularly orangutans. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, so that was quite a while ago now. That was before this sort of year in Zambia where I really started focusing on Africa. So at that stage, I was traveling all over and trying to do as much as possible in Asia. And I wanted to do the orangutans and I wanted to go... I'd been to the north before, the Malaysia side, and it was a bit tame. So I wanted to go to the Indonesian side, Kalimantan, which is is a lot more wild feeling. So there you basically charter a klotok. It's like this wooden boat with a really noisy engine that sort of chugs you up the river into the national park. And you sleep on the boat and head into Tanjung Puting National Park. And they've got this rehabilitation center there where they take orangutans that have maybe been orphaned by deforestation or taken out of the pet trade and try and rehabilitate them into the wild. And so you've got these orangutans in various stages of rehabilitation. Some are really tame, just hang around people all day. Some are like a second generation rehabilitated, so they sort of semi-wild, but still pretty comfortable around humans because their parents are. And then you've got these wild orangutans as well, who are, much harder to get close to. So yeah, you come across this whole sort of range of different orangutans, but it's a really cool place. Like, obviously just towering rainforest either side. You have other really interesting species like the proboscis monkeys. And there's these certain orangutans you can get very close to. And then the other ones, more of a challenge. Some of these more wild ones as well.
How deep into the jungle did you go to find some of the more wild ones? I would imagine it's like a very dense, remote area.
Yeah. And I wasn't there for that long. So basically it was a case of going up and down the river, and the best chance really of finding them was to find them when they were near the river, and then, at that point getting shots of them. So when I was sort of on foot, that was nearer the rehabilitation center where you're getting those rehabilitated orangutans, and they're sort of ones that are more comfortable around people. And then the more wild ones, I was actually photographing from the boat mostly.
I always thought it was interesting. I spent some time at the Lanai Cat Sanctuary in Hawaii, which is essentially, it's a sanctuary that they built because a lot of the feral cats were predating on critically endangered bird species. So instead of trapping, sterilizing, and then letting them back out in the wild or just euthanizing them, they put them all into a sanctuary. So there's like 600 cats in this small, yeah, it's actually like, it's surprising. Like for a smaller enclosure with 600 cats, it actually feels a lot more open and like less claustrophobic than you would think. But what I thought was interesting is kind of what you were alluding to with the orangutans, is that even a single generation difference of habituation to humans like drastically changes their behavior. That I always think it's interesting that you could have this wild orangutan that needs to be habituated looking at its same species who may be 2 or 3 generations habituated and still is like completely afraid of humans or doesn't want anything to do with them. He must think that the habituated ones are crazy or something like that.
Yeah, I know. I don't know what they think. I mean, they're obviously pretty intelligent, so they probably do figure out from that, that maybe humans aren't so bad. But some of the wild ones you don't get close to at all. So yeah, they sort of have to, I guess, learn it for themselves.
And then to keep jumping, I know my transitions are horrible, but I want to get to these things. The panda photo. Pandas, I feel like, are something that a lot of wildlife photographers don't have in their arsenal. It seems to me like there's not a clear path to being able to photograph a panda, particularly in the wild. I mean, I know yours was in the wild. Can you talk about how that happened?
So that was really lucky, really, in that this national park in China where these wild pandas live, for a short period of time, a few years only, it opened up to tourism. And so I was lucky in that I realized, I saw this opportunity. You could go there, you could just get a local guide, go there and go look for these pandas. And so, I went out there and did it because, pandas for me was an animal, bucket list animal. I just wanted to see them for myself. So I did this trip, and then a year or so after that, they shut it off again. And ever since then, it's pretty much been off limits unless you've got serious connections. So I was very lucky with that I was able to get out there, get those shots, and did it at the right time. But that was amazing. I was basically there for a couple of weeks, and I had this tracker and this guide. And the tracker just knew this place like the back of his hand. And we went to 2 different areas. And basically we were trekking all day. It was hard trekking. These pandas have basically been pushed into areas that people don't want to go. So they're really steep-sided mountains that people don't want to grow food on, don't want to live on. So that's the areas where there's still the forest that they need. And so you're walking all day up and down these crazy steep hillsides. And we're basically looking for signs of fresh panda activity. Because they don't get a lot of nutrients from their diet of bamboo, they're basically eating all day, and a lot of what they eat just goes straight through them. So if you're near a panda, you basically see a lot of fresh panda poo, and you see a lot of bamboo that's been chomped, snipped off as they're eating. So you're basically walking all day looking for signs of fresh panda activity, and then when you find it, there's probably one not too far away, and so that's the area you then sort of look more closely in. And these pandas, they make a lot of noise when they're eating. When you do get near them, they're basically just snapping bits of bamboo off. You can hear them a mile away. So you sort of do know when you get close. And so over the course of that couple of weeks, we got close to a few wild pandas. But there was this one particular one. We were on top of this ridge, and he was a young male. And he'd probably had become fairly habituated to researchers, so he wasn't that skittish, unlike some of the other ones. And we were basically on a path and on top of this ridge, and it was by far the easiest route this panda could take if he wanted to get anywhere. So we were on the path, and he just came up on the path in front of us, and he decided the path was his, and he just walked straight along the path towards us. And we had to get off the path, and he just came past me. If I'd wanted to and reached out, I could have touched him. And
no way.
Came that close to a wild panda. It was unbelievable. And I probably spent, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 minutes with him before he went off into the down the steep-sided hill slope. But we later found there was another male panda in the area, and I think he was kind of so distracted by figuring out who this other male was that we were definitely not a priority for him, and he just basically let us get super close to a wild panda. So yeah, I was very lucky with that experience, and that's certainly one of the sort of highlights for me of my career, and probably something that just a case of right place, right time in many different ways.
Yeah, that was a wild photo because I follow every wildlife Instagram account I possibly can, and you never see pandas. And if you do, they're usually at that breeding facility.
The research,
like a research facility. Yeah. And I saw it in one. Not only was it a wild panda, but it was also wide awake and like not just sleeping or like bedded or something to that effect. Now I know. I guess they close off a lot of the areas now to tourism to be able to take those photos. But I saw that, I was like, oh my God, that's the experience of a lifetime.
It was crazy. And I was just doing that as a regular tourist, really, just hiring a local guide and local tracker. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people have seen that and said, how can we do that? But unfortunately, they just shut it off completely. So who knows, maybe they'll open it up again. But I don't know.
Do you think, I know you said unfortunately, do you like where do you find, I feel like it's such a tough balance to strike between, obviously that's such an amazing experience, and it also would provide so much funding to be able to get tourism into the forest to be able to view these animals. But at the same time, there's also something about the encroachment thing that is obviously an ongoing fear about. There's the downside to ecotourism. One, it brings in money, but it also brings in the encroachment of people into wild habitats. What are your thoughts on ecotourism in general and where to find that balance? I know it's probably very specific case to case.
Yeah. I mean, I think pandas is an interesting example in that I think that China, they don't really need the money to protect the pandas. If they want to protect pandas, they can make it happen. But a lot of places, that's not the case. And so I think the other interesting sort of comparison would be the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, where it's very similar in that they're sort of marooned in these mountain forests in the Virunga volcanoes. But there, the governments don't have the resources that the Chinese government have to protect them. And so for them, ecotourism is absolutely the only reason really I think they're still there, is because they generate so much revenue through ecotourism, and that's what's protecting them. That's what's incentivizing local people to protect them, because it's so important to the local economy. And then this week, the news that mountain gorillas are no longer critically endangered comes out, so it shows that it's really has turned the tide there. And so I think that's where it's done right. Well, in some ways it's done right. So the way they do it there, in order to minimize disturbance to the gorillas, because obviously that is the potential downside of ecotourism, it's very well regulated there. So one group will get visited once a day by a group of no more than 8 tourists, and you can spend a maximum of 1 hour with them. So these gorillas, they get a bit disturbed for an hour a day, but the rest of the day they are left to their own devices. And so really it's pretty minimal disturbance. It certainly doesn't affect their ability to feed or get on with their lives. And it just it generates crazy money for their protection for paying. So I think that's done right. Obviously, if they were being harassed every hour of daylight that they're awake, that would be a different matter, and they wouldn't be able to get on. And there's other places you go in Africa where there are much fewer controls, and you do see the sort of downside of tourism. But I think when it's done right, it's often when it comes down to it, local people who are the people who are the most important in the fight to save their local wildlife, they're only going to be if they're struggling to get by anyway, they're only going to be incentivized to protect something if it's worth more to them alive than dead. And so
100%,
if they can make money out of these gorillas through working in lodges and that sort of thing, then obviously it makes sense for them. But if they get nothing out of it, and they can make a quick buck by chopping down a tree and selling it for firewood or something, then they're obviously going to take that route if they've got no other options. So for that point of view, often tourism, I think, is the only way, or the best way by far, to make it make economic sense for the local stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think to even expand on that, in an increasingly urbanized world, I think a big problem that we're having is we just have such a disconnect from wildlife in the natural world in general. that being able to offer people the experience to get out of the cities and actually interact or interface with these wildlife creatures that typically were reserved to planet Earth or something to that effect is really important, because it shows people that they're real and they're majestic and they're worth saving, you know?
Yeah, and I think, obviously if people can have the opportunity to see them, it's, just amazing for people. I think one of the problems that there is with things like this gorilla experience is that it is so expensive. It really, only the, people with a lot of money can even afford to do it. And so a lot of people who often are people that maybe live closer to nature and perhaps have more opportunity in their life to maybe undertake conservation actions, those are the people that are priced out of seeing gorillas and things. So I think there is a bit of a problem in that, sometimes the people that could most benefit from seeing these animals aren't the people that can afford to do it. So a lot of places sort of do try and address that by, for example, in South Luangwa, where I was in Zambia, a lot of the lodges basically fund a sort of school bus to go out, get school children from the local communities and take them on safari so that they can see these animals. So if people can be, and the right people can be brought in to see it, then I think, it can inspire this love of the natural world. And that's obviously a big thing. And that's really, I guess, as a photographer, that's often what I'm trying to do, is take images that show people these animals and inspire some sort of, feeling towards them, and hopefully inspire people to want to protect them.
Yeah. And I think there's also there's always that grass is always greener mentality, right? Where people always tend to gravitate towards animals that are exotic or really hard to find or far away from where they are because they haven't seen them at all. But I really believe that if you take the time to appreciate and understand the behaviors of animals that live in your own backyard, it's something that you can interface with more regularly and significantly less expensively. I mean, even when you start to understand the biomechanics of a hummingbird or a black bear or a grizzly bear or anything, even some of the more elusive stuff like a mountain lion that I could find in America, it's certainly things that I always use the example of, if squirrels were as rare as koalas. Like, people love koalas. You go over to Australia and see them, and they're these amazing things. I think squirrels, like, if you just look at it, if they were as rare as a koala or they lived only in Australia, people would think they're just equally as amazing. So I think sometimes you got to just remove that desensitization that you have to your own local species.
And often the locals, like some of the best photo projects I've seen are of local species, in that people have the access and the means to be able to spend all year with these animals and just focus on them. And the longer you spend photographing an animal, the more creative you have to get, because you get the easy shots and then you have to start thinking creatively to get something you haven't already got. You spend more time understanding the animal. You sort of, from that point of view, can sort of seek out behaviors that are more interesting. So really, those are the best subjects, are the ones that you can revisit again and again and again. And, once you think you can't take any more photos of it, that's when you have to get creative, and that's how you sort of take your photography to the next level. Yeah,
well, I mean, bringing it back to what you said really launched you into a new category in wildlife photography is when you created this new ability to photograph animals in a means that had never been done before through the BeetleCam. And you really have to be able to get creative with it, because people have taken close-ups of mountain gorillas with a telephoto lens. Like, that's happened. You know what I mean? Like, it's very hard to find a unique angle to that. Whereas if you could spend every single day out in the backyard with some white-tailed deer or something like that, you could probably find a unique way to express them.
Definitely.
The third and last photo that I wanted to get into a little bit were the macaques that kind of hang out in those hot springs in Japan.
Okay. Yeah.
So can you provide a little background as to their behavior and how you found them?
Yeah, so that again was one of these trips where I was in my phase of exploring as much as possible. And so I was only with them for like a day or so, but and this was actually quite a while ago. So it was before. Since then, a lot more has been done with them, and there are a lot more. Now you go there and there's photographers everywhere. But back then we were the only, me and my brother went, and we were the only photographers there. And basically these macaques, they live in and around these geothermal hot springs, and when it's cold, they discover that it's quite nice to take a warm bath. So they will get into these hot springs and just sit there until they get hungry or something and have to get out. But they'll sit there as long as possible, mostly. And so, you get these this whole family, this troop of macaques in the hot springs. You can tell they don't want to get out, so they just hang around there, and you can get pretty close and photograph them with all this. It's cold air, so the hot water's just steaming, and so you can get these really atmospheric shots of these monkeys in the steaming water.
I always think it's funny that they're so cute too, and the fact that they like bundle up together. They're almost like homies. Like they love like wrapping their arms around each other and like just like hanging out in the hot tubs all day long.
Yeah, they don't seem to like the cold, which is funny given how cold it is in those mountains. But yeah, they're really fluffy as well. So yeah, they look pretty cuddly.
What elevation is it at? Is it like a pretty steep hike up there?
It's a bit of a hike, yeah. So you take I can't quite remember now, it was a while ago, but you take a train and then a vehicle and then a trek. But yeah, it must be pretty high, but I can't remember the exact altitude.
So I want to head into our last segment, which is kind of my rapid fire questions.
Okay.
And just kind of get your quick thoughts on a few things. What would be your favorite animal that would be somewhat unexpected, that people like, not one of the top 20 animals in the world that people tend to typically point to?
Okay. Well, do wild dogs count? For me, they're sort of rock stars, but not a lot of people. Yeah, I love wild dogs. For me,
rock stars. That's it. That's a cool.
Yeah. No, so the wild dogs, like, there was this phase in the 2000s where I was going to Africa a fair bit, and wild dogs were like top of my list. And I went to a few places just to see them, and I didn't find them. And so they sort of kept getting elevated in my mind as this animal I wanted to find. And it wasn't until that year in Zambia, where it's quite a good area for the wild dogs, but it still took me 3 months before I saw them. So 3 months where I was really every day I was asking people, have you seen the wild dogs anywhere, that sort of thing. And eventually after 3 months, I found them, and it had been then, that was 2012. So So I'd been doing it almost 10 years without seeing them at that point. So when I did finally see them, it was such a massive, rush, and it's so exciting. And ever since then, I've never really lost that feeling whenever I see wild dogs. Yeah. It always is kind of chance encounter because they do cover so much ground. If you hear they've been seen in this area in the morning, you go back and they could be miles away by that point. So always bumping into them is a bit of a hit and miss thing. So it always does feel really lucky when I do see them. And so for me, yeah, I think wild dogs will always be special for that reason.
10 years, that's crazy.
Yeah,
how big are the packs they usually travel in? Is it like 5 to 6, or can they get bigger than that?
Yeah, they can get bigger than that. Mostly the ones I've seen, 5, 6, that sort of number. But I think they can be as many as 20. And they have quite a few pups each year. And they're at the end of the day quite fragile animals. So there's quite a high mortality rate. But in areas they're doing well, they can get quite big. But yeah, in Tsavo, I came across a couple of packs. One only had 3 in, and then the other one had 5 in, something like that.
How about the best moment you've ever had as a wildlife photographer, where you kind of were in the present moment being like, I can't believe that I get to do this for a living?
I think there's too many of those to count, really. But like that first time I saw the wild dogs, the first time I saw that elephant with the massive tusks. Mm-hmm. Let me think of one I haven't said. Okay, so there's this one particularly special moment I remember. I was in Zambia in this place called Busanga Plains, and it was at the coldest time of year, and it's actually gets really cold there, so much so that you get frost on the ground in the morning, which in Africa is quite unusual. Mm-hmm. And the other I guess, exciting thing about this place is the lions there are really impressive because it is cold. They're pretty bulky. They have really lustrous manes. And so I'd heard about the male lion in this area being really handsome and really impressive. And so I was desperate to see him and went to sleep. And then during the night, I could hear this lion roaring. So I knew he was somewhere around. So got up the moment the sky started to get a bit light, got up and went out to look for him. And then because it was cold, the whole landscape was blanketed in mist, and as the sun came up, all the mist just turned this incredible color of orange, and then silhouetted against this mist was this amazing lion that I'd come to see. And so that was a pretty special moment.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
How about the scariest moment? Has there ever been a moment that you feel like you've kind of crossed the line and might have been a little too close to contact or close for comfort?
Often in the moment, I don't feel fear. It's sometimes looking back on a situation where you think, oh, that was a bit dodgy. I feel much less safe walking around a city street at night in a dodgy part of town than I'd ever do in the wild. But yeah, there's been a few occasions. Probably the one I think about the most often would be I was tracking rhinos on foot, black rhinos, and they're pretty grumpy animals. They really don't like other creatures, really. And so I was with the anti-poaching scouts who go out and find these rhinos. This was in North Luangwa in Zambia. So they go out every day and find a different rhino just to check up on them. And so I was basically shadowing them, and we were after this particularly grumpy female rhino. And when we got close to her, she was sort of bimbling away from us, feeding, and she was just, we only had a view of her backside. And so the scouts, they were aware that I wanted to get photos. So one of them just made a clicking noise to get her to look up. But she didn't just look up, she just turned and charged at the noise.
Oh, wow.
And everyone, the scouts that were with me, they were already 10 meters away, sprinting for the nearest tree to climb. They didn't, it's everyone for themselves in that situation. So I then dive into the closest tree and try and climb up it. But it was such a small tree that it just bowed down under my weight. And so I was left hanging, a meter off the ground with this angry rhino where I'd been tossing her head up and down. So she's then charged back and forth a few times because they've got very bad eyesight. So fortunately, she didn't sort of figure out where I was before she left. But that was quite a exhilarating experience.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah. Favorite book and documentary?
Favorite book and
wildlife
documentary.
related.
Yeah. Okay, so documentary. I'll start with that. It would be the BBC Natural History Unit ones like Planet Earth, but probably before that, the one that I probably watched 100 times was The Trials of Life. It was like a early 90s David Attenborough one, when I was, I guess, maybe at a formative time in my life growing up. And just that really inspired me about the natural world. So that's probably the one that's had the biggest impact. But yeah, more recently, like the Planet Earth and Planet Earth 2 and that sort of ones. Obviously, they're amazing.
Amazing.
And then book... wildlife related. I love the Remembering Wildlife series, and I know you've had Margot on the podcast. So
they're fantastic.
I saw her last night actually. So
really?
I'm a big supporter of that sort of initiative, and those books, they've got to be in anyone's bookshelf, I think.
100%, and I'm linking them again. I link them in pretty much every podcast in the show notes. So buy those books. 100% of proceeds go directly to supporting the conservation of those specific animals. And the last question, if you could place a billboard on the side of a major highway that disseminated one message to the world in 10 words or less, what would that be?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, there's so many issues you could pick up on. I think the biggest thing is, I think the biggest frustration I have is that the people that could make the biggest difference, i.e. the politicians, are often, it's just not even on their agenda. And so I find it really frustrating when, they could put in a regulation or a policy that could make a massive difference to so many different things. So I think getting our politicians to seriously, make the environment a priority, I think would be the sort of biggest thing we could do. So getting our politicians to care, and whether that's just voting for the politicians who have environmental agenda, or actually the other politicians, just getting at them to care more about these things and put these things on their agendas. Because I think, that's, without them doing big policy things, it's so hard to really make the sort of drastic changes that need to be done to actually reverse a lot of these things like climate change or whatever it is.
100%. And lastly, I'm going to link to all your social channels, website, etc. And we'll be releasing this close to when the book is going to be released. You don't have a hard date yet, correct? Or is there anything else people should be aware of and looking out for?
So the book, I guess, is that it should be. I'll let you know via email.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't quite know. It could always be delayed. But anyway, it's at the printers now. So the book will be called Land of Giants. And my website, if you just go to willbl.com, willbl.com, that's a sort of landing page that then directs you to the various other things that I do. And so obviously the book will be mentioned there, and then you can see my photography website there and some of the other things I do there.
And the book is mind-blowingly amazing. Definitely check it out. I can't wait to get it in a non-digital form. I love your work. Really thankful for you taking the time to be on the podcast. Everybody else, if you're not following Will yet, you have to. Yes, you'll thank me. But anyways, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.